Hello and welcome to Iran 1400. I am Behruz Qamari Tabrizi, Professor of Near Eastern Studies and Director of the Sharmin and Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies at Princeton University. Before we begin our event today, let me go over some logistics of the program. We will open the conversation with our guests' short opening remarks of 10 to 15 minutes. After their remarks, we will have a short conversation before I open the floor, the screen, for questions from our audience. You can submit your questions through the Q&A link at the bottom of your screen. Microphones will remain on mute, and I will collect and pose your questions to our distinguished guests. Hopefully, we will get a good number of your questions within the 90-minute time of the program. And also, before I begin, I would like to thank my colleagues, Becky Parnian, who is our events coordinator, and Pete Novak, who makes the technological infrastructure for these programs. This past Saturday, with the spring equinox, the year 1400 began in Iran, ending, by all accounts, a tumultuous century of social, cultural, political, economic transformations. A century that was divided between two radically different political orders, each of which brought major disruptions and discontinuities in earlier social relations. And also a century that has seen continuities in major predicaments of Iranian society in terms of hierarchies of patriarchal oppression, persistence of inequalities, and quest for justice, dignity, freedom, and sovereignty in whatever ways those terms are defined. Here with us today are three leading scholars of their respective fields to offer some general perspectives on the past century and prospects and challenges of the future. I will introduce our guests, all three of them, before giving the screen to our first speaker. Djavad Salehi-Isfahani, originally from the city of Neyshabur in the Khorasan region of Iran. We do have a Maktab Khorasan in Shi'i mystical tradition, and I wonder if there is any relations to Maktab Khorasan in Professor Salehi-Isfahani's work. He earned his PhD in economics from Harvard University in 1977. But I always think that his major accomplishment in life was to rank first in the entrance exam of Tehran University in 1967. For those Iranians in the audience who would recognize what an achievement that is to rank first in those exams. I have the privilege of knowing Hadi Isfahani, Salehi-Isfahani, Djavad's brother, as a good friend and a colleague, who also ranked first in the national exam. So ranking first runs in the family, I guess, of Maktab Khorasan. Djavad Salehi-Isfahani is currently a professor of economics at Virginia Tech in Blacksburg, Virginia, a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. He is a familiar face to all of us Princetonians because he spent a spring semester of 2018 as a visiting fellow at the Iran Center here. He has taught a number of prestigious institutions such as University of Pennsylvania, Oxford, and has been a visiting fellow at Brookings Institution, research fellow at the Belfer Center at Harvard Kennedy School, and also served on the board of trustees of the Economic Research Forum, a network of Middle East economists based in Cairo. The list of his accomplishments are too long, and the list of publications are too long, but I just wanted to have a very brief introduction here. So let me move on to our second guest, Azadeh Kian, a distinguished professor of sociology and gender studies at the University of Paris. She is the director of social science department and director of the Center for Gender and Feminist Studies and Research, as well as the editor of its widely respected journal. She earned her PhD in sociology from the University of California in Los Angeles. A prolific writer and a regular commentator on current events on mass media outlets, most notably on France 24. She is the author of, most recently, Women in Power in Islam and Towards a Revolution in Iran, Is the Green Revolution Possible? She has co-edited a number of volumes on different aspects of gender, politics, and social transformation in Iran and in the Middle East. Last, and by all means not least, my good friend and colleague, Nasrin Rahimieh, a professor of comparative literature and director of humanities core program at the School of Humanities at the University of California in Irvine. She was the director of Dr. Samuel M. Jordan Center for Persian Studies and Culture at the University of California in Irvine from 2006 to 2014, where she built an amazing program there. She earned her PhD in comparative literature from the University of Alberta in Canada. As a leading scholar in her field for the past 30 years, Professor Rahimieh has been investigating and writing on intercultural encounters between Iran and the West, modern Persian literature, literature of exile and displacement, women's writings, and post-revolutionary Iranian cinema. She is the author of Iranian Culture, Representations and Identity, which came out in 2015, Missing Persians, Discovering Voices in Iranian Cultural Heritage by Syracuse University Press, and Oriental Responses to the West, Comparative Essays in Select Writers from the Muslim World. Should I mention, Professor Rahimieh, that you are from the province of Gilan, and we share a connection through coming from the same region in Iran. So let me stop here and invite Professor Salehi-Isfahani, Djavad, to open our conversation. The screen or this floor is yours, Djavad. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm really privileged to be in this panel with Professors Kian and Rahimieh. I appreciate your invitation. I hope not to bore you too much, but you know, the job of an economist is to use graphs. I'm going to begin with, I assume you're seeing my screen now. This is my first slide. What I'm showing here is the long run economic growth of Iran in the past century. And it's a very good view offered by a particular set of data from the Madison Project data, the 2020 version. It has the same information, meaning living standards as GDP per capita, comparable because it corrects for cost of living for about 200 countries. If you look at Iran in that perspective, here I have Iran and Turkey. Turkey is a very good comparator for Iran. But if you plug in any number of countries, Brazil, Mexico, Tunisia, Egypt, you find that most of these countries had per capita incomes around 2,000 to 3,000 at the beginning of the Iranian century, 1300, which is about 1920. Not much happens in most of these countries until 1950s and 1960s. And there you see Iran overtaking Turkey quite impressively because of some reforms that were made. Most likely, the land reform of 1960s played a big role. Then it was followed by the oil boom. There was also a basis that was laid in the 1930s and 40s by Reza Shah, which started building Iranian infrastructure. His son followed up by using that infrastructure, roads, telegraph, railroads, to the benefit of the private sector, which took up manufacturing and raised per capita incomes in Iran quite impressively. That process that was mostly operational until 1970s was kind of derailed by the oil boom when Shah abandoned his policies and economic mayhem followed, which I think had something to do with the revolution coming at the end of that first oil boom. Then there is war and destruction that brings GDP down, GDP per capita, and all the gains from the 1960s or 70s are pretty much wiped out until another oil boom comes to the rescue. Iran stabilizes. There are some economic reforms that I'm going to talk about briefly. Iran is able to again grow very rapidly, and this growth now comes to a halt with a very different phenomenon, but not maybe so different because it's another dispute. This time it's not a physical war, it is an economic war with the United States, and the sanctions basically create a stagnation. For the last 10 years, Iran's economy has not grown because of sanctions. Turkey has grown, many other countries have grown. So if you were to describe the last century for Iran, it would be pretty much okay. There was turbulence, there were ups and downs, but we started with about a couple of $1,000s per capita GDP, and we ended up with about 17,000, which is in the range with a lot of countries, again, with Mexico, Brazil, and so on. Let me move on to the next. One of the things that economists emphasize as a backbone of economic growth is human capital. And here I have average years of schooling, which goes all the way back to the 1950s. And here you see Iran not doing so well compared to Turkey, and certainly doing a lot worse than Korea. And that gap between Korea and Iran has remained basically constant. Iran may catch up at some point, but in terms of human capital, we've been behind. That's a running story of the past century. Economic growth in the past century was mainly a product of export of oil. And hopefully in the next century is going to be different. Something else that happened that's really important after the revolution is this change in social structure. I use survey data, annual survey data that's available. If you were to classify Iranians into three main social classes, the poor, the middle class, and the lower middle class, you will find that there is a tremendous change from the 1970s to the present. In the 1970s, the poor were half or more than half of the Iranian population, mainly because about 2/3 of Iranians were living in rural areas and smaller towns. The oil boom begins to make a big difference in the poverty rate before the revolution, but then things come to a standstill because of the war and revolutionary dislocations. But sometime in middle 1990s, because of some of the reforms that came just before that, mainly health, education, family planning, and freeing up the private sector, the middle class begins to grows very rapidly, reaches nearly 60% of the population. And you can see from this graph that most of the gains of the middle class is coming from the ranks of the poor. So this transformation is basically one in which a country that's poor and basically trying to take care of its basic necessities has become a country where middle class have much higher hopes. If you think of it, the poor, they're very much looking for handouts, looking to get by. The middle class has loftier goals. In particular, they want a better future for their children. So in economic development, the role of middle class is really crucial. If you look at the education of men and women, there are two gaps that are really important for inclusive growth. One gap is between men and women in a country, and the other, for Iran in particular, is between rural and urban. Here you see that people born around 1970s, early 70s, these are people who become adults or reach 18 at the time of the revolution around here. There is a narrowing of the gender gap in years of schooling in rural and urban areas. Of course, in urban areas, women overtake men. In rural areas, the gap disappears. Most of this is probably the result. We don't have proof, but if you look at fertility transition in Iran, and most economic development theories emphasize fertility as one of the reasons why countries do not achieve sustained growth. Because if they have a lucky break and their economy grows, then the population growth can eat up that increase in living standards. Now, what you see in Iran is a country that as late as 1980s, this is quite remarkable, Iranian women were busy with procreation. A family that or a society that on average has 8 births, its women cannot really do a whole lot else in terms of education, in terms of public space and so on. And what happens because of many things, partly the family planning program after the revolution that was focused on rural folk, rural fertility begins to decline and it catches up pretty much with urban areas. This narrowing of the gap in fertility and in education are probably connected between rural and urban areas and is one of the main reasons why Iran has become a much more inclusive country. Now, when you go back 100 years, Iran is a completely feudal country. There is no equality of opportunity. People who are called Ra'iyat have no chance of moving up to become arbab in that system, to become lords. But gradually this changes. And the biggest changes came in the 1990s. Now, if you want to look to the future, you really have to go to demography, because although the social basis for economic growth in Iran has been laid, and I'm very optimistic about the future, it's demography that really shows some very important changes. And demography, unlike economics, is much better for prediction, because if you want to look at the number of adults per children, this is a very important variable for potential for growth of human capital. In the 1990s or 1980s, this number was 0.6. So there were fewer adults per children. And then you reach this year, this red line is now, it has reached about 2, which is very impressive. Now there are 2 adults per children. In terms of education system, in terms of education in the family, there's a lot more potential. And as you see, predictions for the next century is that that number will remain high. So that's a good news. Another good news from the point of middle-aged people like myself or older people is that the challenge of youth is declining. Youth defined as 15 to 29 outnumbered the adults. This number is above 1. After around 2000, this number tumbles down to 0.4, and it's going to stay for the rest of the century at around 0.4, which is what most developed countries have. Young people used to exert a lot of pressure on the economy, on the society, because the numbers were simply large. And since they were not working and they did not have the education of the older people, the decision-making in the country becomes a little bit more of the street talking as opposed to people in positions of either private sector or public sector. If you look at dependency ratio, you also see some positive signs. Iran had 2 child and elderly people per working person until recently, and that number has come down quite a bit. And it is going to stay for the next 20 years at a low level. But then it begins to rise. It doesn't go back to where we have been. Some of the troubles we've had in the past centuries because of this dependency ratio. Too many people depending on too few people. If you look at aging, which is something the government of Iran is now very concerned, it is going to rise. This is going to rise in all countries like Turkey, Mexico, and others where they have had fertility decline. That's inevitable. But again, it's not going to rise very fast for the next decade or so. Eventually, Iranians have to become more productive so they don't just take care of themselves, but they care of their elderly. And I'm going to stop here and stop my share. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Salehi-Isfahani. You already generated so many questions. And it's fascinating little sort of overview there. So let's move on to Professor Kian and another kind of broad stroke of the century and the prospects for the future. You need to unmute yourself, Professor Kian.
No, trying to unmute myself.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here with you today, and thank you for the invitation. Maybe there are some redundancies with what I had prepared to talk about, because I will be talking about social transformations and their impacts on the Iranian society, especially in the past, let's say, 5 decades. The consequences of these unexpected consequences of these social changes. I'm not getting into facts and figures because Dr. Salehi already mentioned a lot. I just want to say that, of course, the majority, the 75% of the Iranian population is now urbanized, and population growth rate has diminished sharply. Also, it is amazing to realize the growth in the number of cities. We had 373 cities in 1976 before the revolution. There are now 1,245 of them, but only 25% of the Iranian population actually live in large towns such as Tehran, Mashhad, Isfahan, Shiraz, and Tabriz, and 25% of the population is rural. So it means that 50% of the Iranian population live in small size and medium sized towns. And these are towns that have started to play a crucial role. And I think that for the upcoming years and for the future, these towns that are going to play also an important role. And of course, the reason that for which we had this rapid urbanization after the revolution was that it happened, in spite of the discourse, the ideological discourse in the immediate aftermath of the revolution that actually overvalued the countryside. And in order to halt rural exodus, the new government, the revolutionary government, provided the villages with roads, electricity, schools, dispensaries, and so on. And so this did not necessarily halt rural exodus, but this had also modernized the rural areas. And I think that a very important difference from before the revolution, but also in some other countries, such as Morocco, for instance, even some parts of Turkey, is that rural areas in Iran overwhelmingly have also become modernized. Rural kids go to school, and then many also to university, and also they have drinking water, roads. Dispensaries played a crucial role, as Dr. Salehi mentioned, when family planning started again in 1989, then they kind of formed local nurses, and they played a crucial role in distributing contraceptive devices to women, to rural women especially. And this has played a very important role in diminishing the birth rates. When it comes to education, of course, we compare today's Iran, 88% of whom are literate now, and especially women, 84% of women are not literate, as opposed to 32% before the revolution. And even in some less developed provinces, such as Sistan Balochistan, the rate is now 76. I should say that I did a lot of field work in Iran for 14 years, but unfortunately, I had to stop doing field work and going to Iran. And for the first time in Iran's history, and this is crucial, the number of educated women is higher than that of men. And of course, this will have and already had important consequences for family institutions and also for the societies. Number of public universities grew sharply from 16 to 90 today, and also Islamic Azad University that has opened branches everywhere in the country. And of course, I'm not necessarily talking about the quality of education. I'm talking about the fact that children, even from lower classes or from rural areas, can now more easily go to university, and this is what they do. But this also had and will have important consequences. And one important thing, as you know, is that the number of women has increased tremendously in universities, and despite the entrance exam that still exists, and to the point that over 60% of 4 million and some university students are women, as opposed to 57,000 of them prior to the revolution. But then if you go to school and you have a diploma, university diploma, then your expectations are higher, of course, and also aspirations to social mobility. And these aspirations that used to kind of be limited to middle classes are now, of course, shared also by rural in rural areas by youth from rural origins. But I think that the most important challenge is, of course, the challenge of unemployment today and also for the upcoming years. When I was doing a nationwide survey in Iran with the Markaz Amar Iran, Center for National Statistics, the most important preoccupation of youth even back then in 2002, 2004 was the issue of unemployment. And today, and I would like to have a discussion with Dr. Salehi, because according to some Iranian authorities, 43% of the unemployed in 2017, for instance, had a high school diploma. So Iran's economy, of course, cannot respond and cannot, provide enough employment for these people. On the other hand, and in the some recent years, probably also due to sanctions, because one should not forget that sanctions, international sanctions, actually started back in December 2006 and more or less continued, is also the deterioration of educational system. I'm not getting into details, but about 1 million pupils had to drop out of school, had to abandon school. And this is the research center of the parliament that recently published it. And the major reason given was poverty. And of course, with the epidemic, COVID-19 epidemic, as you know, this will also be aggravated, because not everyone has access to digital devices. So what happened was that faced with this economic crisis, youth unemployment, epidemic, and so on and so forth, the state actually, I believe, has been increasingly privatized and has started to serve the interests of specific social groups whose support is considered to be vital to the survival of the regime. If you look at how the budget has been distributed in the last several years, I think I was quite struck to see that, for instance, clerical institutions, propaganda organizations, military, pastoran, and so on got the important share of the budget to the detriment of health and educational sectors, and this will have eventually, of course, impacts in the upcoming years. Now, youth are frustrated, especially from lower middle class and lower classes, because they are overwhelmingly, as I mentioned, educated, but at the same time they remain unemployed, and so this is not the same thing when you're unemployed and illiterate than when you're unemployed and, of course, with a high school diploma or a university diploma in your pockets, we are faced with what this started some years ago with brain drain phenomenon, but at the same time, those who have the means, of course, leave the country, but those who do not have the means to leave the country and don't have, of course, financial means, they remain in the country, but it was very frustrated, they are very angry, and these youth are those whom we saw in social riots in both January 2018 and also following the increase in gas prices in November 2019, in over 170 or so large and also small and medium-sized towns. And these riots were very different from the 2009 Green Movement, which was basically a middle class and educated middle class movement, and it was urban educated, and they attempted to transform the social protests of civil society into a political movement to democratize the system from within, whereas and their slogan was, of course, where is my vote? The Green Movement people were still referring to the constitutional law of the Islamic Republic, but with repressing the Green Movement, I believe that this pact was broken, and the Islamic State unknowingly probably, but contributed to the rejection of political paternalism. So the new riots that we saw are independent of political parties, of also middle classes. And this is the first time, as far as I know, since the revolution, that these youth from lower and middle classes are acting independently of these political currents and of course of educated middle classes, and they are constituting themselves as autonomous aggregations of individual, and of course they had a myriad of social and political demands. So I should conclude with saying that the crucial challenge now and in the upcoming years would be the challenge between a modern society with modern aspirations that is overwhelmingly also open to the outside world. We should not forget that through social media, social networks, and so on, internet, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, whatever means, Iranians are overwhelmingly open to the outside world, but at the same, and of course, with all these aspirations I just mentioned. And on the other hand, you have archaic laws and institutions, and so an abyss of incomprehension between the majority of the population and the power elite. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kian. Well, I'm sure there are a number of questions, points that you raised that we can discuss a bit further, particularly with reference to what Professor Salehi was talking about. But let's first hear from Professor Rahimieh, and then we'll open up the conversation. Professor Rahimieh.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for including me in this discussion. I'm delighted to be in the company of my wonderful and esteemed colleagues. Now, as I was gathering my thoughts about the beginning of this new century, and what it might augur for Iranian culture, I happened to see my favorite Gilani comedian. This is to you, Behruz. I don't know if you know his work. Mehrzad Shojai's video on his Instagram site, which is called Tinaz Migas. He routinely uploads short monologues. It's befittingly called Akharin Post Qarn, the century's last post. Like all his videos, it's in Gilaki and launches immediately into one of Shojai's pet peeves, copycat posts on Instagram. In this instance, he bemoans everyone jumping on the bandwagon of marking their last acts of the century. The list he rattles off includes last supper of the century, last bath of the century, the last bathroom trip of the century, and so on and so forth, before asking rhetorically what glories could be claimed for all the previous years of the century. Shojai ends his performance by urging his friends and followers to refrain from sending him New Year wishes. Spare me another year like 1399 is the gist of his final message. Although I would say in far more colorful language, Gilaki, than is appropriate for me to share here. Happy to see the end of 1399, Shojai deftly remains silent about 1400, in line with his worry that wishing for a better year will jinx the possibility of a more promising future. Better the uncertainty and the chaos of the present than the illusory hope for what is yet to come. I share Shojai's reluctance to make projections about the future, not so much because I'm worried about jinxing it, but rather because I gravitate toward Walter Benjamin's melancholic take on historical progress. In his thesis on the philosophy of history, Benjamin writes about a painting, 1920 painting by Paul Klee, called Angelus Novus, I don't know how that would be pronounced, which he describes as, I quote, an angel looking as though he's about to move away from something he's fixedly contemplating. His eyes are staring, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. Now, if you look at the actual painting, you would not decipher any of this. This is his reading. Then he proceeds to say, I quote, this is how one pictures the angel of history. His face turned toward the past, where we perceive a chain of events. He sees one single catastrophe, which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is brewing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. This storm, irresistibly propels him into the future to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress. The end of quote from Benjamin. There's something compelling about this image of a near perpetual storm that I would suggest resonates with recent Iranian history. But the scene of the wreckage is also a productive side of Iranian cultural production of the last century. The 14th century began in the wake of the Constitutional Revolution and the discourses that lay the foundation for modern literary forms in poetry and prose, and saw the beginnings of new modes of artistic expression in the visual arts, cinema, and music as well. For example, I don't need to mention this, but it's good to harken back to Mohammad el-Jamalzadeh's collection of short stories, Yeki Bud Yeki Nabud, published in Berlin in 1921, and it bears the imprint of the Constitutional Revolution. It's not insignificant that it was published in Berlin, reminding us of the political and material conditions that prevailed at that time. In his preface to Yeki Bud Yeki Nabud, we can see the role Jamalzadeh imagined literature would and should play in Iran's future. He begins his preface with a clear declaration. Today, Iran is behind on the road of literature compared to most of the countries of the world. In other countries, literature has, in the course of time, gained variety, and thanks to this variety, it has captured the soul of people from all walks of life and has induced everybody, men and women, rich and poor, from schoolboys to old men, to read. And it has thus caused spiritual development of the citizens. But unfortunately, in our Iran, moving away from the norms set by the ancients has been regarded as a ruination of literature, end of quote. Djavad Salehi targets and bemoans the elitism of Iranian writers who he claims imagine their readers and interlocutors to be the learned and scholarly type. And of course, men, it goes without saying at that time. While he does not address the question of literacy in the absence of an universal educational system, he forges ahead and accuses the writers of not subscribing to what he calls literary democracy. This vision, however raw and underdeveloped it appears from our vantage point today, was instrumental in the conceptualization of literature as a vehicle for social and political transformation. And this intertwining of literature or art and politics, its implicit attribution of the role of the vanguard to writers and cultural workers, which has had long-lasting ramifications for how writers, poets, filmmakers, dramatists, and their works have been viewed. Frederick Jameson's well-known, albeit problematic and dated formulation of third world literature as an allegory for the nation is perhaps an apt formulation for the politically informed act of creation. Fortunately, at least from my point of view, this doctrine does not have quite the hold it used to have in the Iranian cultural scene. Perhaps by virtue of the fact that today there are many more writers, artists, and filmmakers on the national scene, and of course, I might add women, many more women, there has been an opening up, or to borrow Djavad Salehi's words again, a democratization of sorts and a recalibration of the role of the creative writer and or artist. Let me cite an example from an interview with one of the more prolific women writers today, though her name is Belghis Soleimani. She would probably be classified as lowbrow literature, but that's something we can talk about too. While she tackles subjects of great variety, including the most painful periods of recent history, such as the mass arrests and executions that took place in the 1980s, she also writes about seemingly ordinary, banal, and everyday events. In an interview, she was asked about what the interviewer perceived as the decline of the subject matter of novels or stories. Here's how she responds, I quote, "Some people believe that literature must give voice to larger human suffering, or that writers must focus on the most significant events in the life of a nation or nations. For this reason, sometimes we think that attending to insignificant events is beneath literature. But the truth is that the novel is a phenomenon of the new era. And the new era's view on the human being accords with the novel, because in the new era, the ordinary human being gains importance, and this very ordinary human being becomes the narrative's protagonist." You can hear the irritation in her response. It could be said that the era of heroes has passed. Today, in fiction, the preoccupations of average characters becomes the subject of writers' work. In other words, it would seem that history and major events have been replaced by individual and ordinary lives that take place away from history or even mock history. And that's fine. End of quote. Soleimani's response does not suggest that a work of art ought to be divorced from history or reality. In fact, her own novels some of them, I would say, like that of other contemporary writers, delve into the traumas of the past 40 years. Soleimani is one of the few contemporary Iranian writers who has taken on the subject of the mass arrests of the Mujahideen and other leftists. Her novel, Doggone Yeah, published in 2013, is about a young Mujahid sympathizer who, escaping arrest, flees Tehran for his village and hides for decades, improbably, I would say, in his family's barn. Delving into the psychic anguish of a young man fearing for his life, Soleimani gives a glimpse of a tormented soul. It is the tragedy of her generation to which she returns in most of her writing. She humanizes the terrified and lonely young man who sleeps in a shallow grave he has dug out in the barn, and she depicts the tedium of his existence. Soleimani's writing is itself an attempt to make sense of the moral morass ordinary Iranians have had to face every day. In the same interview I just cited from, Soleimani was asked why she keeps writing about the 1980s. Her response is, I write because I write about it so I can be freed from it. This notion of freedom is interestingly at once individual and collective, but it does not necessarily shackle the individual to a monolithic collectivity, or I would like to put it provocatively, a nation in need of salvation. I'd like to conclude by referencing a particular sequence in an older film from 1996, I think it was, Mohsen Makhmalbaf's Nuno Goldun, which was translated, the title was translated as A Moment of Innocence, in which Makhmalbaf, the former revolutionary, attempts to restage his own past, specifically an attempted bank robbery he plotted at the age of 16 with the purported aim of supporting a revolutionary movement. And now this really happened in Makhmalbaf's life. So the film is about restaging that episode. In his restaging of his own youth, the director interviews young men interested in playing the young Makhmalbaf. He seeks a suitable actor to play his younger self. The person who answers his question with, I want to save humanity, is the one he knows he's going to select and ultimately selects for the role. But during the interviews, when he does not hear his expected reply, he prods these young men and says, but don't you want to save humanity? One of the young men during this interview gives him an unexpected answer. He says, I don't know about saving humanity. If I just saved myself, I'd be happy. In this response, as in Belgheh Soleimani's, I detect the seeds of a future that does not map neatly onto hopes, desires, and expectations of the past. I can't pretend to know what the future holds, but I do detect that our angel of history might turn ever so slightly from the past to steal a glance at the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nasrin. This was such a wonderful, beautifully crafted piece. I'm going to ask a very general question before opening up to questions from the audience. The reason I wanted to bring the three of you together was to sort of think in a broader sense of things that are happening in society, tangible, easy to identify, easy to investigate, with things that, as Nasrin was talking about, things that are that can be conceptualized as articulations of hope and feelings of connectedness to a present, to a past, and hopes for future, which are not really identifiable in a very rigid sense of tangible things that we can address. Many of the issues that I hear Djavad raised and Azadeh raised are a combination of the two in my ears, that there is a sense of change in aspirations that one can relate to changes in education, changes in social relations, changes in globalization, changes in artistic and cultural production, which defines a new way for the populace to connect with their own existence, and things that are happening in society. These changes are happening at the same time, and often they produce unexpected results. And I see that in all the three presentations I heard today, that those unanticipated results, that unintended consequences of changes, of policies, of cultural production, which makes, and that's perhaps the source of ambiguity of history, and that's perhaps the source of ambiguity or reluctance about predicting the future. And I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about these unanticipated changes, transformations. You know, we talk about, I mean, many of the things, I would imagine that many of the things that you just mentioned today would appear very counterintuitive to many of our audiences and people outside this conversation. How do we make sense of these unintended consequences? How is it possible for us to engage with these things that are really unexpected and defined in different ways? I thought I would never live to the time that I would sometime feel sympathetic to things that Durkheim would say. I like this notion of anomie, that he says that, you know, this kind of disconnect between people's aspirations and the realities of possibilities on the ground, you know, and that kind of disconnect constantly creates what he calls terms anomie, and we can see that in Iranian society very easily, that that sense of disconnect of expectations, anticipations, hopes, and the real possibilities on the ground. So yeah, it's more of a comment rather than a question, but I wonder if you can sort of follow up on this line of thinking, and we can start, you know, any of you if you want to start, and then we can move on to the questions. Djavad, why don't we start with you, because we go in the same order? You're mute. You're on mute, Djavad.
Thank you. That's a very tough challenge to take that into certainly the economic sphere. You know, societies and economies almost always move in directions that are unintended by individual actors. So, you know, if you ask someone, I have actually asked a lot of older people who lived in the 1920s, in the beginning of the century, and including my mother, who's now 95. And if you ask them what they would have hoped life would be like today, a lot of them couldn't imagine how good life has become in the last 100 years. So that's a very, I mean, unintended consequence, right? They would hope that there would be warm water when they want to wash clothes, that the mother-in-law wouldn't tell them that they need to have, you know, 10 children, that going to school for a girl wouldn't be such a big deal that would require a lot of consultation at the community level. These changes have, I mean, these are the desires that people had. They didn't know they had them. I don't think people had desires that they should have natural gas in their homes. Now, 86% of homes in Iran have natural gas. And moving forward, I think there's going to be similar things that are going to happen, that maybe they do have wishes that are fairly well articulated right now. Average Iranian family is obsessed with the future of their children. That is a big deal in terms of economic development. Whether they actually will get there is a different question, because they're not the only actors, right? There's the government, there's other people who want different things. Just take globalization. Some Iranians believe that connecting to the rest of the world in a peaceful way is good for their children. Their children would become like the children of Koreans or Thais or even Turks, right? Others would say, no, we don't like you to do that. So this is now getting in a very complex way articulated at the national level, and we have these sanctions story and they come back and forth. I don't think anyone can now guess exactly what's going to happen, but I'm going to put my money on the fact that the desire is there, and maybe Iranian political system will find a way for this one wish that people have to happen. Another big wish everybody has now is to remove the competitive education system, which is killing young people, right? Everybody wishes that, without a doubt, but they have very different ideas about how to achieve that. Iranian politics has become so distracted from these problems and is dealing with Syria, with Yemen, other things, that I don't see how, without giving up or solving some of those problems or postponing them, they can deal with this one thing. How do you get children to learn stuff without putting them in competition with others endlessly, so that by the time they're 22 or 24, they're completely exhausted? I'm not talking about the top 1% who are doing extremely well and showing up at Princeton. I'm talking about the average kid who is now losing faith in the whole system because the education system is failing them. I don't know if this is answering your question at all. I just took a stab at it, but
no, that's helpful. Yes. Nasrin, Azadeh, do you want to?
Well, if I may, I would just like to mention the gap or the unintended consequences between some state policies and the way the society responded, to the point that today the public policy and the state can no longer halt this ongoing process that has been set into motion some years ago. And if I may, I would like just to mention two examples. I don't know whether I'm responding to your questions, but you see, for instance, we talked about family planning, we talk about women's education. I have here something I would like to show, if I don't know whether we can, which also responds to a point Djavad mentioned, because in this survey we did in Iran, well, it was some years ago though, it was in 2002, but we had 7,600 married women in our survey, and all in all, over 30,000 people. And you can see the correlation, Djavad, between the level of education of mothers and the number of their children, regardless of their religion, ethnicity, and where they live. So this shows, and I can show you the table here. I mean, it shows what? It shows that at the beginning of the century, the discourse of Iranian intellectuals was that women should get educated in order to be better mothers. But this has turned into, I want to be more educated, but at the same time, I'll have definitely lesser number of children, and I want to educate them better, but also I want to spare some time on myself. Iranian women are no longer, just taking their time to take care of their children. They also are thinking and acting for themselves, which is also very much reflected in our literature, literature written by women in Iran. So they think for themselves, and they have also probably individualized also interest, and this is, I think, a very important change that had taken place in our society. Another thing, of course, is that when this rationale is put into motion, then state authorities cannot halt it. For instance, the leader from 2014 onwards decided that the Iranian population should be doubled. And so they stopped family planning, they stopped distribution of contraceptive devices and so on. But the fact and figures that we have today shows that in 2019, the number of newborn children in Iran has diminished by 22% comparing to 2014, which means that the society is going its own way and the state authorities are going their own way. And this is why I mentioned this gap and eventually also the rupture between the society and the state. And this probably in the region, because Djavad compared Iran to Turkey, which is a very good comparison. But this is also a very probably specific to the Iranian society. Because look at Saudi Arabia, for instance, some reforms are being taken by the government, but in Iran, it seems to me that something has been provided by the state, because this was a post-revolutionary society, but then the society took kind of charge of itself, and you can see the difference everywhere. Even within, again, poor families who also do aspire now to the same things that Iranian middle classes. One important example, as we mentioned, both Djavad and myself, is education. Everybody now wants their children to go to university. Going to university is no longer a dream. It has become a necessity for people, and they do so. And this has given a lot of authority. I have seen this in a lot of villages where parents are illiterate, but their children go to school and then even go to university, and they have gained enormous authority, important authority over their own parents, but also, again, throughout the, within the whole social environment. So these are really deep-rooted changes that have occurred in our society. And I think that we will have yet important, again, results of all these changes in the upcoming years. People want, as you mentioned yourself, Behruz, dignity. They want to be respected. They want dignity, and they want to take part in their society. In the world, they need to have their own place in the world. And this is also thanks again to a lot of policies that have been applied at the beginning by the government, at beginning in post-revolutionary Iran, which is a continuity. We should not forget, with pre-revolutionary Iran and even for the past century. But now we are seeing the results of these changes. Aspirations to human rights, to women's rights, to democracy are now very, and to secularism, I should also add, are really widespread in Iran. They are no longer, you mentioned, Nasrin mentioned Zadeh, and so intellectuals of those years, but these demands are now really very much extended to the majority of the population, or a lot of people. Maybe we haven't taken any statistics, but this is the very reason we are having all these riots, these social protests, and so on and so forth. And this makes Iran one of the most liveliest, demanding populations and societies in probably in the entire world.
Very good. Thank you. Nasrin?
Yeah, I agree, even though this is not within my expertise and knowledge, but the mere fact that more people were educated and the number of universities had grown, and some of the things that the government did itself, right? Making education more accessible, or things that Djavad and Azadeh have just mentioned, means that, you know, literacy itself, the very dream that Jamazadeh had, but he doesn't mention how to get there, the Islamic Republic, actually continuing from before, has made possible. I think the unintended consequences have a lot to do with what has changed on the ground and how people feel in little ways empowered. But I also think it's about, so in the realm of culture, literature, so on, film, I think that I've sort of fallen back into the Foucauldian notion that every time, you know, there is power, there's going to be resistance within. So these little networks that are created by virtue of the fact that the state tries to move things in a certain way, and it can't ultimately control all the various deviations that happen. And if I can just say quickly about what's changed in society, I agree completely with Azadeh. I mean, look at the number of women writing, and even though there's this attempt to squeeze this kind of literature, which, you know, I'm opposed to calling it omnipasand and so on, they're writing about really important, weighty things. I feel like we should study them without worrying about labels. The number of novels I read now, short stories, and even Dostanak, that's like vignettes, that in which women are alone by choice, through divorce. They are no longer the ones who feel that they have been cast aside, but rather they've chosen. And when the husband, the ex, shows up, there are really interesting dynamics between these characters. Now, I'm not suggesting that literature is a perfect replica and reflection of what's happening in society, but if you put these characters side by side with novels that were produced before the revolution, there's a tremendous change. And it's not just on the level of women having a voice and a place. I mean, look at the number of filmmakers, women filmmakers behind the camera. In front of the camera, we have a tremendous kind of revolution that happened in spite of the Islamic government, the Islamic Republic's ambitions and desires and laws that it tried to institute. But it really is impossible to put the genie back in the bottle.
Yeah, that's true. Since I have you now, Nasrin, here, there's a question about translation we talk about this kind of incredible production of literary works in Iran, but much of the world is unaware of these productions, and translation is very limited. It reminds me of some time ago, maybe 10, 15 years ago, Tom Friedman, maybe more than that. Tom Friedman was in Iran, and when he came back, he said that, I wished Iranians could read the translation of the great philosophers and like John Locke and everybody says that, you know, did you go to the front of the Tehran University and look at the bookstores? And so it's definitely the case that the translation has a sort of a unidirectional presence from other languages into Persian, but we don't see much of the other direction from Persian to other European, Western, or widely read international languages. How can we explain that? I mean, possibly the explanation is very simple, but how do you see any possibility of any change in that directionality?
That's an excellent question, and one that makes me think that I wish for more lifetime so I could translate more. But it's very true that there is a disconnect between what is being produced culturally in Iran and what we know of it outside Iran. And in the US, it's very much market driven, it's crass market policies. Publishers, I mean, the times that I have myself either approached publishers or tried to help other translators approach publishers, if they are trade publishers, they immediately will tell you, we don't publish this kind of thing, it will not sell. Now, it's why won't it sell is itself also a question we need to attend to. I think that some of the literature is not palatable for the American Western audience, perhaps more in France. That's why we see more translations come out first in France or Germany before we see it in the US, because there are certain kind of prevalent tastes in the marketplace, and publishers go along with that. That's why we see that there are university presses that will, on rare occasions, publish things. In fact, there are, Syracuse University Press, I think, has taken the lead in is publishing a little bit more recently. But unfortunately, there's also the economics on the other side, which is that there are people who do this kind of translation as a labor of love. There's no money to be made in it. Translators are, at least in the American marketplace, rarely paid adequately, and it's a very considerable labor, and to do a good translation one really needs to devote a lot of time. Some of it, I think, is just, I hate to say it, but it's the image of Iran in the media. Who wants to read about Iran unless it's sensationalism that actually confirms what we see in the media? So, if I hate to put it this way, but there are certain works that will be read. All you have to do is put the picture of a veiled woman and write about oppressed women and the horrible punishments and the life in Islamic Republic. No, it seems that I would say the problem lies, I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, mostly in the American scene, not the Iranian scene. Because as you mentioned, I'm in awe of how much translation is done in Iran. And in the old days when I could go to Iran, I loved walking in the bookstores, walking on top of it, across these piles of books and thinking, oh my God, I can't decide between all the work that I want to pick up that are in Persian and the translations. So it's a complicated question. We have tried, various publishers have launched series. Now, these are not university publications and trade publishers, but it is really difficult to break that barrier.
Yeah, one of our fellows here, Milad Odabai, is working on a book on translation, but again, translation into Farsi. So we are eagerly waiting to see his book coming out. There is a question also about a document. I don't know if you remember Djavad and Azadeh in particular about this Cheshmandaz 1400, the document that came out 25 years ago or so. And it was sort of a prediction of the government of where will we be in 25 years from now, that Cheshmandaz, or like the prospects of 1400. And Nasrin, also you, if you remember that document, can you comment on that? So what was that document, and where does Iran stand now that we are in the year 1400? What was accomplished from those kind of predictions that 25 years ago the state was making? Unmute yourself, Djavad, please.
Okay, good. If you want, I'll take a tack at that. One of the good things that's happened in Iran, I think, is policymakers and economists have abandoned this planning for the future as if they know what's going to happen. This turbulence that you also referred to in your introductory remarks really precludes making big plans for the next 20, 25 years. Needless to say that very few of those things that were put in that plan for the 1400 have been achieved, including the growth rate. Many things have intervened, the price of oil, sanctions, and what I think maybe if one says something positive about it is that in that plan, which was written pretty much by Rafsanjani's people, and he was pro-globalization, pro-private sector. So some of those principles of economic growth under the Islamic Republic became established. And today, when you have this shift from globalized economy, oil exporting economy towards what the Supreme Leader imagines is a resistance economy that's a bit more self-sufficient, those principles have been maintained. People who talk about resistance economy do not talk about government-run operations, government-run businesses. So I would say there were good things in that plan. It settled some disputes. Let's agree that governments cannot deliver economic development. But it failed in setting more specific policies. For example, identifying how are you going to proceed with this massive demand for education that Azadeh has also talked about. The way they approached that, it was completely outside the plan. Ahmadinejad came and opened the doors of universities. And you now have 1 million people studying for exams to enter master's program. Used to be 1 million people sat for exams to enter universities because these universities don't really give you the skills to work, to earn a living. People then say, let's go to the next level. Now there are central examinations for the PhD, which nobody cares anymore about. But something like this should have been in that plan. That if Iranians are changing from creating children to creating human capital, the education system has to come between these families and between the private sector who's going to hire these people. They need to be talking to each other. What are the skills they need? There are plenty of good models to follow. None of that is in that plan, they are in the 5-year plans, by the way, but the 5-year plans come and go and nobody pays attention to them.
I have to add one thing to what you said, Djavad, that people still do care who ranks #1 in these exams. So that thing has not changed from the time that you were #1 to now that people still, I see that they publish their pictures in the newspapers that they rank #1 in the exam. So
I have news for them. 70 years later, it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah. Azadeh, did you want to add something to what Djavad said about this? Yeah.
No. I nothing. I don't want to say anything.
So there's another question, which is also again on the economic side and social side, that we see these changes in rate of poverty that is going down, and then with the difficulties of foreign investment in Iran, and the claims that the government makes about the end of recession in Iran. How do we sort of make sense of this kind of economic situation in Iran? Lack of significant foreign investment, all these sanctions, and at the same time, sort of falling rate of poverty, and then coming out of recession. How do we sort of make a story, a narrative from all these different kinds of seemingly contradictory claims, economic claims?
Well, Iran has a kind of foreign investment, which is called oil revenues. Mm-hmm. Foreign investment is basically money you cannot save from your own income, your national income, so you get from abroad. Oil income does that for you. The trouble is that it doesn't come with other good things that foreign direct investment comes with, which is discipline, technology, know-how about how to run businesses. And the money goes to the government. That's the worst part. FDI will go directly to a business sector, but oil money comes to the government, which then tries to distribute it in various ways. It often trickles down from Tehran to major cities, and it creates inequality. If you look at Iranian inequality, every time the oil price goes up, inequality increases. And that, by the way, was the spectacular story in the 1970s when inequality exploded. So foreign investment is really good, but Iran doesn't need it, because if it can export oil, it can buy technology. Supposedly, the government now, especially Iran's supreme leader, has said trade with the rest of the world should be geared to technology transfer. And he's pessimistic that the Europeans will do that. The Chinese, he thinks, might do better. Most Iranians actually disagree. Business sector, they think Europeans and Americans are better for technology transfer than the Chinese, but that's a different story. About this latest claim of Iran's economy getting out of recession, well, the data isn't all that good. There are two sources for GDP data. Central Bank of Iran says we are out of the recession because we have achieved a couple of quarters of positive growth. And they believe that for the last year, GDP has grown by about 1%. The Statistical Center of Iran, which published data independently, disagrees with that. It shows the economy didn't really grow positively. Another complication in looking at recession and getting out of recession is whether or not you want to include oil in the national output. And I personally think it shouldn't be. I think GDP should be more the product of activities of Iranians, which in some sense is connected to their productivity. If you look at that, things look a little bit more reasonable, more optimistic. And there's an obvious reason for that. When the currency depreciates, which Iranian middle class hates, especially the ones who want to travel abroad, want to send their money to their kids, or want to send their money to Canada or Spain or whatever, it's a very good thing for the economy. This is another one of those points where Iranians cannot agree on what's the best for the nation. Some want a very cheap dollar, others want expensive dollar. Government, to its credit, has allowed this foreign exchange market to, which is on side. It's not the official rate. The official rate is too low. It makes no sense. But they have other markets between exporters and importers and the free market. The signals that come from those markets is that if you produce, you can sell. And you can sell for good money. You can sell domestically because imports have become very expensive. You can also export some. Iran has a brisk, if troubled, export business in Central Asia and with its neighbors to Iraq, even with the Persian Gulf. And one of the things that sanctions do right now, which is terrible, is Iranian labor has become cheap, which is another way of saying is competitive now, but it prevents them from exporting. Iran's economy itself is weak. It cannot sustain increasing demand for production of, say, manufacturing. But there are plenty of people in the neighborhood who want Iranian stuff because they are cheap and they are decent quality. But Americans prevent Iranians from selling something and bringing the money back. If I were the Iranian government, I would say, the hell with the oil exports. You like sanctioning our oil, keep doing it. Just allow our ordinary people who produce something to sell to Afghanistan, to sell to Iraq, for two reasons. A, they become richer, this middle class can keep going and become hopeful about the global economy. B, if Iranians go to Iraq to trade, it's much better than going there to meet other militias in Iraq. So the kind of, I would say, lack of foresight on the part of US government is mind-boggling.
Yeah, yeah.
Behruz, if I may,
Sure.
I'm not an economist, as you all know, but referring to your question on poverty and the fact that the poverty has increased, in the recent years, I have also been reading some Iranian economists inside Iran, and also the Center for Statistics that talk about high inflation rates, lowering in the purchasing power of the households, including the middle class households, but also lower class households and so on. And also the Parliament's Research Center that released some research arguing that about 17 to 20% of the Iranian families now live below the poverty line due to this, of course, inflation and the lowering of their purchasing power. And of course, another reason being that the state that used to redistribute parts of these oil revenues, especially to poorer families, is no longer doing it, or not as much as they used to do. So this is something, but again, inequalities in Iran seems to have increased. This was also the case under Khatami government, and he himself accepted it. So you have a minority of the population with really, as you know, they are very, very rich. And then you have middle classes and also lower classes who have or lost their purchasing power in the past some years. But the feeling of being poor is something that you compare yourself. People are not economists, but people go and purchase things or try to purchase things. They can't eat meat, they can't eat fruits, they can't buy fruits for their kids, and you're telling them poverty has decreased. But they feel it in their daily lives that they are poor, and they are poorer comparing to a tiny minority of extremely rich people. So poverty is also something that is kind of relevant to your expectations, again, to go back to what we were saying. For instance, I saw in some Iranian villages, they did not have tap water at home, but they had drinking water just outside their homes. And they were unhappy about it. They would say, I want tap water in my kitchen inside. And so we are poor, and, whereas in, 50 years ago, they didn't even have drinking water. And so the feeling of being poor, and also relevant to these increasing inequalities, social inequalities in the country, which is also much relevant to the oil revenues and those who benefit from the oil revenues, is really paramount. And again, this is what seems to be happening in the country.
Thank you so much. I would like to ask this final question from Nasrin, that if you can offer a short answer, yes or no, that would be fantastic. But many people argue that the constitutional revolution actually was so much integrated into a literary revolution at the same time. So the two went hand in hand, and without thinking about cause and effect, but they're sort of integral part of the same social transformation in poetry, in songwriting, in literature. Do we see the same kind of significance of a literary and cultural revolution in Iran that is pushing forward these processes of social change in Iran at the level of the constitutional revolution?
I don't really think so. For one thing, because at the time, or around the time of the constitutional revolution, we didn't have this large population, nor did we have the kind of dissemination of venues and possibilities that today have really changed the dynamics. And I think that there's also a little bit of, if I may call it, and this is totally unscientific, revolution fatigue. You know, those kind of holding up ideals that we would all share. What I sense is this kind of, that's why I used Shojai, is that, leave me alone. Let me just do my thing, right? I do think that there is overall change, but not quite on the same massive scale as we saw, and a kind of unidirectionality and a drivenness that really accompanied the constitutional revolution.
So with apologies to those whose questions you didn't get a chance to ask, and thank you so much again. This was a wonderful conversation, and hopefully next time we can have all of you in person in Princeton, which is a totally different kind of dynamics and exchange of ideas. We are all sick and tired of these screens and these virtual conversations, and soon we hope that we can host you in person in Princeton. And again, I'm very grateful for your participation.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Behrooz. I want to thank you for putting this together, and I learned a lot from listening to my colleagues too. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.